if our witnesses are even needed. The question I have is that we understand Ms. Beram and the other petitioners' complaints, but without any type of expert, any type of engineer or land surveyor that's called into question our flood studies that have followed everything in the ordinance, I don't see how that they can meet the burden of the preponderance of the evidence at this point. And that I feel that it's proper that their appeal be dismissed right now. Now, with that being said, and I understand that the commission here probably wants to give everyone their day and do that, and we can move forward, but I want to make sure that that objection and that motion is put on the record just for future sake. And we are willing to continue, but I just ask if you would prefer a summary to kind of focus our response.
I'd advise the board to note the objection and to move forward with a short summary and witness testimony.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Just briefly, and we believe this is a lot of Ms. Beram's complaints and the petitioners in general stem from a misunderstanding of the ordinance. When the ordinance specifically states no more than 1 foot within a zone AE, which is what we're currently in this floodplain, in zone AE, you're not to increase the base flood elevation more than 1 foot. Her complaints center around the fill, our well site, and everything that's on the well site being more than 1 foot. It's not the ground elevation that's increased 1 foot. Theoretically, the ground elevation could be increased to the skies, as long as that disturbance, that development on the ground, does not change that base flood elevation, or does not increase that base flood elevation more than 1 foot. And that's what the hydraulic study that's been submitted and that Mr. Gilbert will testify to here has shown, that there's no significant increase in the base flood elevation. Not even 1/2 foot, not even 2/3 of a foot, zero, or no significant. So very little change. And so even with this fill, even with the berms, even with these operations in there, we're not increasing the flooding. We're not going to affect people upstream, we're not going to affect people downstream. We're putting it in an area in such a fashion to where it's not going to affect that flooding. And most of it stems, and like I said, Mr. Gilbert will explain this, most of this stems because, if you can see me pointing here, this area is lower than over here, and it accepts most of the flood waters. So making a disturbance here doesn't change the fact that most of the water's over on that side of the stream. And that's why we're in this situation. It could be completely different if we were building the well site over here. And so that's the position that we're in. In terms of too much information, Mr. Kaufman's payment, if you will, that wasn't put in there for the payment for Mr. Kaufman. That was to show that this subject property, because the floodplain ordinance is dealt around adversely affecting the subject property, that the owner of that property has consented to us being there, has consented to our well sites, to the locations and everything. And so we just wanted to show per the floodplain ordinance that the property that could be adversely affected, the subject property, that the owner was okay with our operations being there. We put information in there to make sure this is the first time that someone has gone through this process in Doddridge County, and in terms of oil and gas well drilling, possibly in the entire state, in terms of floodplain. And so we wanted to make sure there was enough there. And I'm sure over the years, hopefully this process will be streamlined and we'll understand what is and what is not necessary. It's unfortunate that in my previous experience, I've never heard a citizen complain that there's been too much information. Most of the complaints I've ever heard about are there's not enough information, they're hiding stuff. We wanted to be forthright and open and provide as much as we can, so that way everyone was fully informed and we weren't hiding anything, so to speak. As for not providing Ms. Beram anything, we appropriately noticed when there was 2 adversarial parties that began. In terms of filing our applications and sending notice, we properly notified the parties under the ordinance. We filed the permits, which are a public record in the court. And then as soon as someone filed comments, we sent Ms. Beram copies of our response. That's the only filing we've had since her comments, was our response to her comments. An appeal was filed, and we chose not to file a response to the appeal and instead come here before the commission and present our evidence and do that. So we weren't trying to hide anything from Ms. Beram. There simply was nothing to be there. Everything's there. Ms. Beram never contacted me. I would have gladly have sent her, and I've got copies here, Ms. Beram, that I can give you of our floodplain permit application, because I wasn't sure the commission had the actual official record before them. And so we're here, and Mr. Gilbert's going to present and explain his process under the hydraulic report, understand what's asked of in the floodplain, and what he did to go through to address most, if not all, of the issues that petitioners have raised in this situation. If there are other specific questions, after Mr. Gilbert, we may have one or two other witnesses to address particular concerns or recent things that were just brought up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're up.
Hello. How are you?
Mr. President, I'm not sure how.
Just asking his full name, maybe some background information so
Okay.
we understand who he is.
My name is Seward G. Gilbert Jr. I'm a professional engineer. I'm a certified floodplain manager. I'm the owner of a company in South Charleston called Engineering Perfection, PLLC. I've had the company since 2004. I founded the company. Prior to that, I worked with Union Carbide in risk assessment and environmental matters. So I had started my first job in 1971. I have a bachelor's in civil engineering and a master's in civil engineering.
And are you a licensed engineer?
I'm a licensed engineer in the state of West Virginia as well as 2 other states, and my firm also holds a certificate of authorization in the state of West Virginia.
Thanks.
So what I'd like to do is do a little show and tell here with you, if I may, and I'm going to jump ahead on this slide to get you oriented first. So can everyone see? So when you look at this slide and you see I'm standing here.
That's why I can move it, sorry.
I'll stand back here. No, I'm not blocking anyone's view. The green dots on there are the proposed tank locations. And the red line is the edge of the embankment, and the blue line is the edge of the proposed barrier that would go around the site, or sometimes called the berm. And that berm would be at elevation 760 feet, and it's there for environmental purposes. Now these slides all are oriented the same. So you can see here's the mobile home that we've spoken of, and this is the Kaufman residence up here. Here's Route 23. This is a pond. This is a wetland area in here. And this is the creek. The creek flows from the top of the page to the bottom of the page. So now that we're oriented, let me go back and show you a photo from 2003. Now, why did I use a photo from 2003? In 2003, the entire state was flown for the state addressing and mapping board. And so we have those aerial photos which I can obtain. And at the same time, the state acquired using stereo techniques, elevation data for the entire state. Now, I had Mr. Jackson as the surveyor, and Mr. Jackson and Mr. Dennis Fisher had prepared drawings, and in those drawings it showed recent fill, the fill that you're concerned about. And we knew that the fill was there. And so in order to make our hydraulic study from an existing condition, we started with the 2003 topography. Now, in reports that have been submitted and that Dan saw, it also talks about 2012 elevation data. But when I prepared the model using the 2003 elevation data, which is this is the same condition that the aerial photography, that the topography was created from, and you can see that there's no disturbance from an oil and gas development in this photo. This is a representation of the digital representation of the topography, and so you can see, for example, here's a 762 here, here's a 760. Now if we look on the other side over here, this is a 754. So as Mr. Jenkins was explaining, this side, the right-hand side, is lower than this side. I'm going to call this, well, in my thinking, I'm calling this left, because when I think about the stream, I think about it as I'm going down the river. So if I confuse that, let me know. But on river left, it's lower than on river right. So this is the source of the elevation data we use to create our hydraulic models. Again, the location of all the facilities. This is a 2009 aerial photo, and it also shows the footprint, the proposed development, but you can see it in 2009. Nothing had been developed as well. There's another photograph from about 2011, and once again, there's no development yet. These are all, as I mentioned, all oriented the same. I'm going to come back to this one in a short while. What we're looking at now is the same area, and this is this is your county flood insurance rate map. This is what Mr. Wellings uses to determine whether or not a proposed development is inside the floodplain or out. In this particular instance, the residence, there you can see the pond. The residence is up here. The area that is being developed by JB is in here. Here's the mobile home. And so you can see the elevation of 760 and 761. The same sorts of numbers that we've been talking about. Am I blocking your view again?
No, it's okay.
Okay. So this is called an AE zone, which means that an engineering study has been done in the area. And that's why we have these elevations, 759, 760, 761, and so forth. Those are the elevations that are predicted to be the top of the water surface in an event that has a 1% annual chance of occurrence. And that's what he was talking about. The base flood event is the event that has a 1% chance in any year of occurring. Commonly called the 100-year flood, but that led us into problems because people would say, well, we had the 100-year flood last year, we got 99 years to go before we have the next 100-year flood. And that's not the case. You can have 200-year floods in 1 year, or even, you can have 4 in 1 year, you can have 2 in 1 month. So it's just the statistics of it all, and we all know that weather kind of comes in cycles, and when it's bad, it stays bad, and when it's sunny, it stays sunny for the next few days, or maybe even the next month. So,
would you happen to read this latest National Geo where the Netherlands looks at, as we look at a 100-year floodplain, they look at 10,000-year floodplain. Their own work.
right. I have been to the Netherlands,
Yeah.
and I've seen their water protection.
Let's continue.
So this is an AE zone, which means it's an engineered zone. It's been studied. Now that is in contrast to what occurred for the Huff's residence. Where the Huff's residence is called an A zone. And it doesn't have the engineering study that this one already had done by FEMA back in 1991 when the original study was done. So what we needed to do in this instance was set up our original analysis, the analysis of the existing condition, or the 2003 condition, to match what FEMA had already mapped, what they had already said they needed to do. So we didn't have to go as far. We just had to have our model match this 759 and this 761 or 762. You can see the 762 up here. So our extent did not have to be as extensive because we were dropping in a piece in something that had already been done. In the Huff instance, it had not been studied, it's a rough characterization of where the floodplain is. And so we had a lot more work to do in order to figure out what the flood elevation would be. Also, in the Huff instance, the facilities were spread out more. There was a pond that was proposed on a tributary to that particular stream as well. So there are good reasons why the extent of the study I did is less than that for the Huff property. So this is based on probably USGS topographic data from perhaps the 1960s, something like that. It's a pretty rough cut, but it's common in what FEMA has been doing. And we're going to look at this in more detail with something that I prepared. Actually, we can look at it in front of our slide now. Yes. So, so this is using the same elevation data as FEMA. The same water elevations, but with better topography. The topography from 2003, the topography that came from the state.
I do have a question.
I think you'll need to wait to the end.
You have to wait some.
So you can see here that the Kaufman House, which is located here, is right on the edge, but it's outside the 1 in 100 year or the 1% annual chance floodplain.
So you're underwater here, right?
I'm going to object again if Mr. Stump could, if you could please wait till he's done testifying, then you'll have a chance to ask a few questions.
So once again, to be oriented, we analyzed this with a concept called cross-sections. And those are what you see in the green lines here. And the numbers on those represent the distance from the first one we did, which is 0, which is off the screen here. And so you can see that the model we did encompassed where the mobile home is, that's downstream of the development. This is the development site here. This is a temporary area that may be used for storage for a period of time. JB has told me that this blue line, which represents the Jersey barrier, the dike, will be removed at the time that the wells are completed and all their wet construction and all that is done. So site restoration will include removal of what you see in blue and this, which represents a pond. And so the footprint would be what is in red here. And also the area that's in red here was included in the permit, as I understand, as an option that probably won't be exercised. So the aerial extent of the development is at the end of the day, in something like 6 months, 9 months, will only be inside what this red line shows, where the well is. So we draw these cross sections, and we included the modular home or the mobile home here. We also went past the home of the Kaufmans here, and so we've encompassed both of the nearby structures. And the modeling shows that this area of construction here does not significantly change the water surface in the base flood or the 1 in 100 year flood event on the Delaware Creek. And that's what we stated in our report.
I'm sorry, Mr. Gill, I just have a couple questions to make sure procedurally we do this. So these, I believe we've marked, or at least you've shown and discussed 9, photographs right now. I would move to have these admitted as exhibits, JV exhibits 1 through 9.
Say receive.
She.
Mr. Jenkins, are you going to give a copy to the appellant?
I am. I've got copies and then for each commissioner as well. I'm organizing for the clerk so she can keep her records straight.
Thank you.
The ones that I had written on there.
Want me to go ahead while you collate, or you want me to wait?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start.
So I can go ahead.
Just hold on a second. Here you go. So there's 1 through 9. I've already marked them on the bottom there for the clerk. And then if the commission would like to take one of each, they're in the order that I had marked them with the clerk, but if there's any confusion, I've got a list of them here that we can try to keep track of them. And then, Mr. Gore, I just have another question regarding those 9 that we marked as JV exhibits 1 through 9. Does this all represent information that was reflected in the flood study that was submitted as part of JV's application?
Yes.
And is there a similar picture within the flood report that shows the Kaufman residence and the trailer and the different cross sections?
Yes.
Okay. If Mr. Gilbert could proceed, or if you would prefer to wait till these are passed out?
I have a question for you, and I'd like to do it now versus later. You've just stated, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you said that the modeling that you did shows the area of construction does not substantially change the base flood level. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay. To what extent is there any change to the base flood level based upon the end result of the construction that will be done by JV?
For the construction, which in the interim period, when this blue dike or berm is in place, the change is 0.07 feet, which is less than an inch.
And that is the final result of the construction after it is completed?
That's during
The construction process?
the construction process.
Okay. What is the effect of any change on the base flood level after all construction is finalized, other than, I understand there's this proposal of an ancillary project that may or may not occur later?
Yeah, the ancillary project would be part of this, not
Analysis?
not later.
Okay.
And
so-
it doesn't affect the analysis. That was only for edification,
Okay.
explanation, and the model, the difference is not perceptible in the model. It's less than 0.05 feet.
Thank you.
If I show my numbers out to the 100th of a foot, which is 1/8 of an inch, then I can see the difference, but when I go to 1/10 of a foot, the rounding, it disappears. And that's what I showed in my report.
Okay, and just so I'm clear, the net effect of any change in the base flood level after construction is completed
Yes.
is 0.07 feet or less?
It's less.
Less than 0.07 feet?
Yes, 0.07 is when the berm is in place.
Okay, and the berm will
is
be
coming out.
removed?
Yes.
The berm will be removed at the end of
Yes.
the project?
Right.
Thank you.
And the standard is 1 foot. So we're at an imperceptible amount, half an inch less, compared to a standard of being able to begin to permit up to a 1 foot rise in the water surface. So what?
Does that less than 0.07 feet have encompassed in the model any gravel that was added to the land prior to the application for the permit in this process?
The starting condition was 2003, before any change was shown, as we looked at in the photo.
Okay, so your starting point is prior to any gravel being added to the surface of the project?
That's correct. And
And-
that is intentional, because we knew that some changes had been made to the job site, and once their stuff is added, how are you going to figure out what was there? So we used the best available data, which is good data. We've been using this 2003 data on other well sites as well.
So your end result opinion, as I understand it, is inclusive of all of the development done by JB on the land?
That's correct.
Thank you.
I could elaborate, if you wish, on what the term floodway means. It doesn't apply in this particular instance. Would you like me to elaborate on that briefly? So, in an AE zone, and I'll go back to that other figure here. So on the flood insurance rate map, which is FEMA prepares the document and is adopted by ordinance by the community, in this case, Douglas County. And in areas where there's more development anticipated than would be anticipated in this location, depending on the funding that's available from FEMA. So, for example, Charleston or Bridgeport or some other more developed area, and under more developmental pressure, would have a separate engineering study done to determine, okay, now if we fill in the edge, and we keep on filling in, and I mean fill in entirely, how far can we fill in and raise the water level a foot or less? And that determines what the floodway is. And that space is reserved, and we're not allowed to fill in there at all without jumping through extraordinary hoops. And so this particular area does not have a floodway designated. I'm not sure that there's any floodway in Douglas County. And as Mr. Jenkins mentioned, the 1 foot that's in the ordinance is allowable rise. So that would mean that at this point, instead of the water elevation being 760, it would be 761. That's the 1 foot rise that we're talking about. It's not the height of a structure, it's the height of the change in water level. A couple more slides, and then we'll go on from there. This is more for your information about this mobile home. Mobile home presently is in the floodplain. We can see that, well, you can see it here. And the mobile home's at risk now, without consideration for what JD has done. Another premise in hydraulic modeling is that, or another fact, is that in conditions for this stream, the impacts are only upstream of some kind of a confining structure, such as these berms, as minor confining structures they are. And they don't have any impact downstream. So this project, even if it had an impact, a significant impact, it would not have an impact on this mobile home. On the phone, you asked me about velocities, and since then, I went and checked, and our study shows that there's no change in the velocity. As I recall, it's 2.1 feet per second of water flow past the mobile home. The same in either case. These are the kinds of diagrams that Dan gets to look at. And rather than giving you a tutorial on it, I'll just mention that at the Kaufman residence, it's showing that the base flood elevation, meaning the elevation that has a 1% chance of occurrence in any year, is 760.3 feet. Now you got to look at this kind of with a magnifying glass to kind of figure all this out. It's a lot of squinting. What I do is I do this. I blow it up here so I can see it. But that's modern technology for you. So remember, 760.3 at the Kaufman residence. 760.3. It's at the bottom of the slide too. Now, Jackson Surveying has surveyed the elevation of the lowest adjacent grade and the lowest natural ground, or the present day ground, around this structure, and found the elevation to be 764.2. And the elevation of the first floor, the top, where you put the wax down, and where you run the sweeper, is 768.3. So this home appears to not be influenced by the base flood elevation with a significant margin of safety. Refer to the notes. I'd like to just briefly talk about computer models. The computer model that we use is from the Hydrologic Engineering Center of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in Davis, California. It's been under development and improvement for probably 40 years. The name of the model is called River Analysis System, and it is the gold standard for performing analyses such as what we perform. In order to do an analysis such as this, it takes a couple days. It's not that we just drop it in and get an answer back right away. When we get results, we invariably find that we want to add some more information or modify something to make the model run more smoothly and more reliably. It's an iterative process. You run the model and look at what the result is and say, oh, I need to improve the understanding in the model in this location or that location or some other kind of a change. Not trying to end up with a certain result, but there are measures to determine how active the model is, and we're converging on the solution. And that's what we do with this. So it's not just a plug and chug kind of a modeling exercise. And then at the end, we look at the results and say, do they make sense? I've been trained in the HECRAS modeling. I have one employee, his name is Bob Acapenti. Bob is a 40-year employee of the Corps of Engineers in watershed management and in floodplain management. He's retired now and works for me when I have work for him to do. So Mr. Acapenti and I together reviewed the results of this model, and we were both satisfied with the outcome. Mr. Acapenti is also a professional engineer, but not in West Virginia. Are there points I've missed or other questions?
Am I understanding you correctly that after the construction that's anticipated by JB, that the base flood elevation will be 760.3 feet in this area
Yes.
of the Kaufman home?
It does not change at the Kaufman home.
Okay, and that'll be the number of where the base flood elevation will go with this increase that you've testified to earlier of less than 0.07 feet.
Yes.
And that the base of the Kaufman home sits at 764.2 feet in elevation.
Yes.
And the first floor of the Kaufman home is at 768.3 feet.
Yes.
Does the Kaufman home have a basement, to your knowledge?
I can answer that.
Yes.
It does.
Affirmative?
Yes, it does.
Is it a finished or unfinished basement?
I can't answer that one. I don't know.
What about the trail?
So So at the Kaufman home,
Hold that question. You can hold that question.
there's no impact from the proposed project. And the lowest adjacent grade is 764, so even if there's a basement, unless the water runs in from the bottom, from a grade of 760 feet, which is 4 feet below where the finished grade is, there's no path of entry. For the mobile home downstream, there's no impact. The JP project has no impact on that location.
Do you know at the Kaufman home whether it is serviced by county sewage or county water versus well water and or a leach field with a septic tank?
I do not know.
Okay. Thank you, that's all I know.
They don't have city water.
They have well water.
With the septic tank?
Yep.
Okay. So assuming that there's well water and there's a septic tank, I assume, I live in a flood, I grew up in the middle of a floodway, the Ohio River. And we all know that floodwaters first rise to get into the homes through the sewage system, unless you have a particular drain clogging device or pipe. So this particular home doesn't have city or county sewage, so there should be no mechanism for the water to rise through pipes going into the home. Is that accurate?
That's beyond the scope of my study.
No. I'm just curious. Okay.
At this time, we looked at various other pictures, and I realized in my numbering system, there is no Exhibit 6, I don't believe. So, but to keep the record straight for references and everything, we'll just exclude Exhibit 6 and just recognize that there's a skip in the numbers. Is that correct?